T.I., they're calling this a historic election. Can we call this your first time voting historic?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Without question.
T.I., you've done it.
Yeah.
How does it feel?
Great, outstanding. Feel like I've taken advantage of my right to become part of the democracy. I feel like it was definitely it was worth getting up early in the morning. It was worth standing in line. It was, it was worth doing all the things that people complain about doing when they talk about voting. I think it's more than worth it. Just talking about it, I'm actually leading by example.
Hello everybody, thank you for being here today. It means a lot to us. DREAM Act would help us out a lot because we have worked really hard for our education, to access our education, to pay for our education. If you were to support the DREAM Act, it would mean a lot to us, and the DREAM Act would allow this for me. Thank you for being here again, and thank you for all your
We can't just complain. We got to take some kind of action. We got to at least try. And if everybody wrote, can you imagine if everybody wrote and said, we don't want this? We would all get the response that, okay, we're behind you. That's the goal. Or in November, we'll vote these people out. Thank you so much for your participation, and thank you for watching at Underworld Classroom.
Down to the wire for all the staffers and the volunteers working for the campaigns. They're trying to make sure people get out and vote.
The sign-waving event is for Mitt Romney. You can tell by all of the signs. It's far away from the excitement of the rallies, the debates, and the big campaign buses are the worker bees, campaign volunteers whose job is to get out the vote. Melissa Nash is working tirelessly to do two things on the eve of the primary: hand out signs for Election Day waving and get people to vote for Mitt Romney.
My name is Janine Capizola, and I'm a volunteer with the Newt Gingrich campaign here in Florida. Just calling to see if Newt can count on your support tomorrow.
As the video clips that you just watched demonstrate, there are many ways to be politically involved, or there are many examples of political participation. For example, we may just decide to volunteer for a campaign. We could contribute money to a campaign. You could actually get hired to become a campaign manager or a campaign worker for salary. You could just simply put a yard sign up. You could also not even work for a political candidate or for a political campaign. You might work for a community-based organization that believes in an issue, that's trying to influence the political process. You could write a letter to your congressman or to your mayor or to some other government official trying to convince of how the government should respond to a given issue. You could also protest. The video showed the young lady from California protesting for the DREAM Act. You could also protest if a particular candidate comes along, or if a speaker is coming to town to talk about a certain issue. You might protest against that. There are many different ways for us to get politically involved. We need to realize that political participation, as your textbook talks about, goes beyond the voting booth. Most of us think about the way that I'm going to influence my government is by voting for or against a particular individual. That is only one way for us to be politically involved. It is the most common way for us to be involved. Voting is the most common way that we get involved. And the reason that many of us vote and do nothing else is because we maybe think it's a civic duty. We get that little sticker, as you see on the screen, that says, I voted. You get to wear that for a couple of days, and you can, point at people that don't vote and say, well, you don't vote, don't complain. We vote because, really, it's the easiest way to be involved. It doesn't take much time for us to be involved by voting. You usually show up in line. You stand in line for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And then you're done. You get to go home and you can tell everybody, I was involved in the political process. Now, probably the least common way that we as Americans get involved politically is by running for office. And we choose not to run for office because most of us just don't want to put that much time, money, or effort into doing what's going on. We also, a lot of times, people have asked me, oh, you love politics, you love to do these types of things, why don't you run for office? And my favorite response is, too many skeletons in my closet. If I start running for public office, not that I've ever done anything illegal or immoral or anything like that, but, little things that have come up in the past, become magnified. When you run for office, the people in the community look closely at you. They scrutinize every decision you've made, sometimes every paper you've ever written. So it's very, very, difficult to run for office. And that's probably the number one reason that people don't run for office, is because it really isn't easy. When we talk about individuals running for office, that's an incorrect statement, because individuals don't run for office. Families run for office. If I choose to run for mayor or governor or whatever political role I want to try and fill, I'm not the only one that gets scrutinized. It's the families that get looked at. Just look at Michelle Obama. Every time she walks out of the White House, what she's wearing is scrutinized. She can't just go to Starbucks, have a cup of coffee, and say what she feels about certain issues, because even though she's not an elected official, she is the wife of an elected official, and she gets drugged through the same ringer that person running for office does. So running for office is the least common way for us to get involved. And then, of course, other people choose to be involved in other ways. You put yard signs in, you make contributions, you write letters, you get involved, you protest or whatever it is. So there's a whole variety of things that we as Americans can do to get politically involved. Now, when we think about political participation and we think about the American public, a lot of times the American public gets a raw deal when we look at this, because the American public is viewed by many politicians, many media individuals, many political scientists as being uninterested in what's going on, apathetic, not involved. And that is not accurate, because if we look at the figure on page 285 of your textbook, it talks about Americans as far as voting turnout goes, but it also looks at Americans in other types of political participation. And what we find by looking at figure 8.1 on page 285, we'll notice that Americans vote at a significantly lower rate than citizens in most other Western developed countries. But when we look at the other types of political activities, such as writing letters to our elected officials, protesting, being involved as campaign workers, all of those types of things, you find that the American is more involved in the political process than citizens in other countries. So there's really a counterbalance that we have to do here. Yes, we have lower voter turnout in this country than in many other countries, but we do other things that are designed to influence the decisions that our government makes. And some people could make some very valid arguments that even though voting is important and voting does make a difference, me as an individual, my one single vote is less likely to impact the outcome of an election than if I as an individual choose to get involved in a different way. I could go vote for Bill Clinton, and my one vote will go towards him. But if I choose to get involved and become Bill Clinton's campaign manager, put a lot more time and energy in, then I'm more likely to have an impact on whether or not Bill Clinton gets elected. I could go and cast one single vote for a candidate, and that single vote, again, may not make a difference in whether that candidate gets elected. But if I give a candidate $5,000 donation to his campaign, that $5,000 donation may make a bigger impact on the outcome of the election and therefore on the outcome of the government's decisions than if I vote. So I am not saying that voting is insignificant and don't go do it. But to say that we have lower voter turnout in this country, therefore we're less interested in the political process in our country, would not be a correct statement to make, because we as Americans are more involved politically in non-voting ways or citizens of other countries. Now, from our discussions, it's obvious that different people choose to be involved politically in different ways. There are people who choose not to be politically involved at all. And we need to take a closer look at what types of things impact whether we are going to be politically involved or not, or whether we're just going to slightly be politically involved or we're going to get very politically involved. There are different things that impact whether we get politically involved and how significant that involvement is. And one of the first things we need to look at is a concept known as political efficacy. Political efficacy is a concept by which we measure how much an individual believes they can personally make a difference in how our government operates or in the decisions that our government makes. The higher my rate of political efficacy, the more likely I am to be politically involved. If I don't think voting is going to make a difference, then I'm probably not going to vote. If I don't think that I can impact Joanne Emerson's decision to vote for or against a particular piece of legislation, I am probably not going to contact her. So the higher your level of political efficacy, the more likely you are to be involved in the political process. And along with the same thought pattern, the higher my level of political efficacy, the more complicated or more detailed my involvement in that process is going to be. If I think that I really can't make a difference, but I should be involved in the political process anyway, I'm probably going to go vote and do nothing else. But if I think political involvement is important, and I believe that I personally can have an impact on the political process, then I'm going to get more involved, like I may even run for office. When we look at people who run for political office, these are people who believe that they personally can really get involved and really make a difference in the political process or in the way our government operates. So political efficacy plays a large role in whether or not we get involved within our political system. Another thing that impacts whether or not we're going to be involved is our socioeconomic status. And what our socioeconomic status is just a combination of our occupation, our income, and our education level. The higher our income, the higher our level of education, the more likely we are to be involved in the political process. If you have a relatively small income, you don't feel that the government decisions are really going to impact you because the number one government decision out there is taxes. And if I have a low income, I'm not going to pay much taxes. Education level impacts our level of involvement because the more educated you are, the more aware you are of the government, how the government operates, how you can impact government decisions. The more we know about government, the more likely we are to be involved. Occupation has a huge impact on whether we're politically involved. I am a political scientist. I teach several hours a day. The rest of the time I'm sitting around reading political documents. I'm sitting around having conversations with other people who like politics. So those of us who have this occupation of political scientist, we're more likely to be involved politically because we talk about political issues all the time. If I'm an individual who owns a lawn care company and I drive around on a lawnmower all day, operating a leaf blower all day, my job is no less important, but I have less of an opportunity to have conversations with other people about the political process. So your socioeconomic status has a large impact on whether or not you get politically involved or not. Individual characteristics of a person will make a difference. Age. The older I am, the more likely I am to vote. The older I am, the more likely I am to have, a better job. The older I am, the more likely I am to own a home, to have a family, to be getting closer to retirement and worrying about how am I going to survive after I'm done working. All of those things cause older people to vote at a higher rate than younger people. Race has a huge impact on whether I vote or not. That kind of goes back to the whole political efficacy thing. Certain races, like African Americans in this country, for years in our country, African Americans weren't allowed to vote. African Americans were discouraged from voting. African Americans were mistreated if they voted. So for long periods of time, certain races didn't feel that they had could really make a difference. So race will impact the level of participation. And then also an ideology. We talked last chapter about ideology. A couple of general statements about conservatives and liberals. Conservatives tend to be more likely to vote because conservatives tend to believe that voting is a civic duty. Now, liberals, on the other hand, are less likely to vote unless there's something that means a lot to them at stake. But you will find that liberals tend to do other things more frequently than conservatives. They're more likely to protest and things of that nature. There are legal factors that impact whether or not we're politically involved. Remember the whole de jure discrimination. For years, African Americans were, forced to take literacy tests, pay poll taxes, pass grandfather clauses. So those types of things have limited political participation. Other legal factors like who has the right to vote. We can look at, African American males. They didn't have the right to vote until the 15th Amendment was passed in 1868. Women didn't have the right to vote until the 20th Amendment was passed in like 1918 or so. Younger people didn't even have the right to vote. When I say younger people, people between the ages of 20 and 18 didn't have the right to vote until 1971, I believe, when they passed the 26th Amendment. So there are lots of legal factors that impact whether we get politically involved. And then another legal factor that we don't talk a whole lot about, but just the fact that we as Americans are required to register to vote. We talk about voting being the most common type of political participation. 49 of the 50 states require me to go out and actively register myself to vote. And if I don't want to take the time to register myself to vote, guess what that excludes me from doing? It excludes me from voting. We'll also take a look here in the next couple of chapters that the easier it is to register to vote, the higher the rate of voter turnout. So there are lots of legal factors that impact whether or not we get involved politically. The final thing I want to talk about is why America's voter turnout is so low. When we look at voter turnout in the United States compared to other Western democracies, you will see that we really have significantly lower voter turnout. And there's a variety of reasons why we have such low voter turnout. Let's just talk about some of those now. When we talk about political races in this country, There really is no perceived difference between the two major political parties. Last chapter, when we talked about ideology in the political spectrum, we talked about there not being a huge difference between the Republican candidate or Democratic candidate for president, because both major political parties in this country are, remember, classic liberal parties. So while the Democrats and Republicans may differ on high-profile issues like abortion, gay marriage, those types of things, on most issues there's not a real huge difference between the Democrat and Republican candidate. Whether we have a Republican president or a Democratic president, most of the decisions our government makes are going to be pretty similar. We talk about, to get elected president, you've got to get as close to the center as possible. There would be much higher voter turnout in this country if we were voting for a Democratic candidate as opposed to a socialist candidate, or a Republican candidate versus a socialist candidate, because there's major differences between what the Democrats and Republicans think and what a socialist candidate might believe. Another reason that we have lower voter turnout in this country is because the frequency of our elections. You know, you're asked sometimes to vote 2 or 3 times a year. And you're asked to vote for a whole slew of different candidates. You're asked to vote on major, constitutional amendments in your state or bond issues in your state. And then you're asked to vote on local candidates. And we're asked to vote for a lot of different things often in this country. And if we as Americans, we know about American and public opinion, we're uninformed about most issues. And if we're not going to take the time to figure out what Barack Obama or John McCain feel about a particular issue, are we going to spend the amount of time that would be necessary for us to be educated on every single vote we're asked to cast every year? No. And a lot of people, instead of going out and voting blindly or, voting out of ignorance, they just choose not to get involved, not to vote. The day of the week that we have our elections are always held on Tuesdays, in the middle of the day, where you have to try and get time off from work, or you got to, drop the kids off early at daycare, or you have to take your lunch hour. It's very inconvenient, the day of the month or the day of the week that we have elections. And this is a big one here. In order for us to vote in this country, we have to do something. We have to take personal action. And I'm not even talking about casting the vote itself. In this country, as we talked about just a few minutes ago, in this country, before I can vote, I have to have taken the time and the energy and the initiative to register myself to vote. And it seems like a relatively minor thing to register yourself to vote. But a lot of Americans don't take the time to register. Therefore, if they're not registered, they can't vote. That brings down our rate of voter turnout in this country. Other countries like England, when you become of voting age, the government automatically registers you. And we know that the more people that are registered, the more people that are going to vote. So one idea was to let the government register us to vote. We as Americans don't like that. And the one that a lot of us don't really understand is the fact that voting in the United States is voluntary. I don't have to vote. We look at the diagram on page 285 of your textbook. It shows that Australia has the higher rate of voter turnout. Better than 90% of the people in Australia will vote in elections. And the primary reason that Australians vote at such a higher rate is that if they don't vote, they're fined. So there are a whole variety of reasons why we as Americans do. Now the question is that a problem? And that's what you're talking about this week in your forum discussion. Is non-voting an issue? Isn't it something that we as Americans should be worried about, that we have such a low rate of voter turnout? And there are people on both sides of the issues. But here's some examples of ways that people have suggested we can increase voter turnout in this country. Reduce the frequency of our elections. Only have one election a year. Take all of the issues that you're going to talk about during the year and just set up one day a year to vote. We're more likely to be willing to go out and vote one time than have to vote 3 times a year. Change the day that we have our elections. Make elections holidays. Some countries make the election day a national holiday. Or we could have elections on weekends. Whether or not that would make a difference or not, I really wonder if we made election day a holiday, whether people would actually stay home and vote, or would they just make a 2-day weekend into a 3-day weekend, go to the lake, and not even worry about voting. Another example that I had already talked about of how maybe we can increase voter turnout is by having the government automatically register you to vote at the age of 18. But in order for the government to automatically register us at 18, we have to stay in very close contact with the government. They have to know where we are. They have to know where we live. They have to know all of those things. We don't like to give the government all that much control over it. And another suggestion that's being put forth is online voting. No one ever leaves home. I can just vote from my computer. The problem that some Americans have with that is anytime you do anything electronic over the internet, things like that, there's always that chance for fraud or mistakes to be made. It's much easier to control voting if you're doing it in person. There are many different suggestions on how we could increase voter turnout in this country. And there's also a huge debate on whether or not it's a problem or not that we have such low voter turnout.